welcome 2023, and welcome to McDuff Lives. And particularly happy to welcome once again Harley Schlanger to our show. And Harley, good morning to you, sir, and thanks so much for all you do and for being with us this morning.
Well, I'm always happy to join you, John. It's always good to have a discussion with someone who's well prepared.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I have to confess, I didn't catch your show earlier this morning. I kind of saw the theme of it. What you've been basically thinking since past couple of days is, and I titled our little show this morning, "Is Babylon Falling?" Um, one of the old shape note hymns from the Puritans is Babylon is fallen. Um,
Yeah.
Babylon is fallen, is fallen, is fallen. Babylon is fallen to rise no more. But Babylon came back in the form of the British American financial system that we talk about so much, and uh,
Now we should be singing "London Bridge is Falling Down."
I like that song too. Yeah, and yeah, let it fall.
Yeah.
It's time. Oh, anyway, so what do you think? Is it really going to go down this time, Harley? Or I don't know. I haven't been more hopeful in a long time.
Well, empires sometimes take centuries to collapse. And I don't think, of course, that was before nuclear weapons and modern weaponry. But I think this system is in very bad shape. But the population is in bad shape. And the idea that we could have some kind of rally, I mean, I was thinking about this over Christmas time, what it was like living in in Palestine at the time of the birth of Jesus. And, where would there be hope? What would the hope be? You had your crazies, you had your extremists, you had your top-down control, your censorship, your divide and conquer strategy. So it was a miracle. So I think what we've got to do is make a miracle. And, we're seeing some things in that direction. It's very interesting. I have associates who have long experience with Brazil and Argentina. And they were getting messages from our contacts that the military in Brazil is being primed for a coup to keep Lula from coming to power. And Lula, being a somewhat stubborn guy, insisted on driving in a limousine with the top down, where there are crowds of hundreds of thousands of people. And the security forces were saying, don't do it, don't do it. So, you're holding your breath for a moment. But what happened at the Lula inauguration was a whole series of meetings, because heads of state were there from all over South America, from Africa. Top officials from Russia were there. Lula sent a direct message to Putin, saying he's prepared for closer cooperation. In his speech, he spoke about the importance of the BRICS, but also Mercosur and UNASUR, the two integration organizations for South America. The idea of having a north-south corridor, an east-west transport corridor, water management cooperation, the Russians offering to sell tons of fertilizer to Brazil so Brazil can upgrade their agricultural production. So out of that meeting, there was quite a bit of promise. And then the other thing that's really not on the map for anybody is the meetings between the Turkish government and the Syrian government. We've sort of lived in a moment where, after the US and the West launched this regime change operation, which fortunately failed, and when I say fortunately, it was stopped by Russia. The Turks stayed inside Syria, or certainly militarily on the border. The U.S. is still occupying the oil fields and some of the best agricultural land of Syria. When you hear Blinken talk about we have to respect nations' sovereignty when it comes to Ukraine, what about Syria? Don't we respect the sovereignty of Syria? But all of a sudden, you have this very advanced series of discussions going on between Syria and Turkey, mediated by Russia. And then you have the Chinese and the Iraqis talking about, again, extending the Belt and Road Initiative into the Middle East through Iraq. So, there are these hopeful signs of this new financial development architecture coming together. At the same time, you have Stoltenberg giving 3 days in a row talks demanding that NATO stick together and keep arming Ukraine. You have the story of the explosion killing maybe 60, 70 Russian soldiers in Donetsk. The fighting is going to continue as long as the weapons go in. And it just means there'll be more killing for no purpose. But on that note, I think there's something that everybody should be talking about, which is after Merkel made her admission that there was no intention for the Minsk II agreement to lead to a settlement in eastern Ukraine, that there was only a time-buying measure to build up Ukraine for the war. Then Hollande, who had been the president of France at that same time, said that's exactly right. He agreed with Merkel. Now, I've been reading these books by these Russophobic British Chatham House people who say one of the characteristics, the genetic characteristics of Russia, of Russians, is paranoia. They don't think you can trust the West. They're suspicious of the West. Now, I find it very interesting that it turns out that that's not paranoia, that's legitimate. They were lied to from 2014 on about the West doing something to stop the killing in the Donbass region. Now, then you go back 14 years earlier, or actually 24 years earlier, the lying that went on about NATO not moving eastward. And what you see is there's a good reason why the Russians don't trust the West. And there's a good reason why so much of the rest of the world is moving toward Russia. The other point I made this morning is that Chatham House is teaming up with Google and a number of others to try and launch an experiment to try and shift the thinking of the global South away from Russia and China toward trusting the West. And they're doing a model program, an experimental program in India with the so-called pre-bunking. How can you create an environment where people won't even think that they can't trust the West? The idea of pre-bunking is instead of waiting until an idea sets in that you have to debunk, pre-bunk is you change the way people think so they never are susceptible to suspect something coming that's evil from the West. And it's this idea that goes back to Cass Sunstein and others who say that you have to essentially brainwash people so they're not susceptible to narratives, except the narratives coming from the West. So, all of that said and done means that we're in a very dangerous moment in history, but a moment still of potential. And the question, in my thinking, is not what are the establishment oligarchs going to do? They've already made clear what they're going to do. The real question now is, will the people keep going along with it? Is there enough common sense and, more importantly, enough rigorous thinking to outsmart those who wish to brainwash us to keep us inside the narrative?
Rigorous thinking is not approved by the state anymore. You're supposed to just go along, that's why they make these hats that say obey on it. You're supposed to absorb, the information. You're not supposed to put any reasoning, there's no reasoning filter needed anymore. Just accept the information and live your life that way. And that's been a psychological war that's been going on for a long, long time against us, and they just get better and better at it. So they might
Oh, yeah.
succeed. I
Well,
think of the Cultural Freedom Foundation in Europe, and how, you know, so many people bought into that stuff as art, music, literature, and it did keep the West, or at least West Germany, pretty much culturally allied with the Western, what values of New York, for instance, or London, as opposed to um, anything shaded towards communism.
Well, the Congress for Cultural Freedom was largely a product of uh, RCA David Sarnoff, his whole operation, the radio project, Walter Benjamin, combined with Oxford and Cambridge. And they came up with this idea that you would set up a cultural milieu that would adhere to the teachings of the Frankfurt School, which is the so-called anti-authoritarianism, Hannah Arendt, people like that. And this was drummed into the Germans. And the Germans are a perfect example of this. I mean, over the Christmas holiday, I had a chance to spend a little bit of time with my wife's family, and they're from Austria, and they think differently from the Germans. I hadn't really been so aware of it before, but if you look at what's happening in Austria now, they're proud to be neutral. They're lining up with Hungary, with the Czech Republic, not because they're authoritarian. I mean, Austria is a very free and democratic country, but because they actually think differently. They don't think like the Germans, who after World War II were basically told, you're not entitled to your own opinion anymore because your own opinion turns you into a Nazi. The idea that, and this is what I find interesting about what I was saying earlier, these books on Russia from these Oxford and Cambridge types, they talk about the genetic characteristics of a people. The Russians are paranoid. The Russians are have an inferiority complex. They're always asking, why don't you accept us as equals? Well, the Germans have been, the idea of the German genetic problem is if you're proud of your nation, you're tending toward Nazism, and that any form of nationalism is an authoritarian policy, which fits perfectly with the Walt Wriston post 1971 view that sovereignty is the biggest evil in the world, and that you have to end the idea of sovereign nation states. Well, they're trying to do that. In some parts of the world, this worked. Mostly Western Europe, Australia, Canada. But what I'm seeing in response to what we're doing, what the LaRouche organization is doing, is more and more people in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and even Great Britain yearning to break out of this. And I think we may see at some point in the future, looking back, the death of Queen Elizabeth is a turning point, because I mean, most people don't really know what Elizabeth was about. She was very good at covering up her real thoughts and intentions. But there are these new studies that are coming out about the British Empire. The idea that the British Empire was some kind of genteel, civilizing influence was just blown apart by these studies from India that show that as many as 50 million Indians died, maybe even 100 million, under the influence of the policies of the British Empire. And of course, then you have on a smaller scale, the same thing with Ireland. So perhaps since Prince Charles, now King Charles, is not exactly a warm, lovable character, this may be a beginning of a break out from under the control of the Five Eyes. So that's something else to factor into the thinking. And I'm saying a lot of the correspondence I'm getting from people who live in the Five Eyes countries is very hostile to the Anglo-American imperial policy.
You know, some people say that the pandemic is being used, whether intentionally or just as a matter of convenience, to usher in a totalitarian dictatorship in those very Five Eyes countries. And Canada's is one that I would cite, but I think probably the prime example would be New Zealand, where this
Yeah.
Jacinda Ardern just seems to be a complete. Uh, I don't know what the answer is, but she's not she doesn't listen to the people. She just tells them, "Here's what's going to do. Here's what's going to happen." And I hope that the people of New Zealand are able to gain their power back, because it doesn't look like a republic or a democracy to me. It looks like she's just become a funnel for the orders that come from down from on high in the city of London.
Well, in Australia also, there's a growing sense of frustration at being used as an aircraft carrier against China. The idea that the US military strategists have, that is, those who want to go to war with China, is that we have a disadvantage because we don't have a lot of places to deploy troops, deploy weapons. Japan is one, South Korea is another, but South Korea right now is very much occupied with the threat from North Korea. Japan is trying to rewrite its post-war constitution to allow itself to have a massive defense buildup. That may not be too popular in Japan, but in Australia, the idea of the AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US nuclear submarine deal, which, first of all, it's going to take 10 years before it actually is consolidated. But Australia has a problem. They don't have the scientific, technical base to sustain it, which means there'll be a full colony of the United States and to some extent Great Britain. And that means that they will be used as shock troops for the possibility of a war with China, in the same way Australians died in the Battle of Gallipoli in World War I. And so you can see the deeper tendency of nationalism of some Australians yearning for a break from the British Empire, which they've never fully had. Now, Canada is a little different. I mean, in Canada, Trudeau is a joke, but his deputy prime minister, Chrystia Freeland, her grandfather was an out-and-out Bandera Nazi.
Mm.
He was the editor of a newspaper in Galicia, which was the westernmost area of Ukraine, where, by the way, on January 1st, they had marches celebrating the birthday of Stefan Bandera. And that's the World War II figure of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which essentially merged itself, became an agency of the Nazi SS, and carried out pogroms and extermination campaigns. The Baba Yar is the most famous, but they killed hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of so-called non-Ukrainians, including Jews and people of Polish extraction, Hungarian, Romanian. Chrystia Freeland, who is rumored to be the person who will replace Stoltenberg as the head of NATO, her grandfather was made the editor of the newspaper in Western Ukraine that was run by the Nazis and the Gestapo. And he editorialized in favor of the pogroms and the murders of non-Ukrainians. Now, she is an outspoken supporter of the Ukrainian regime. She says there are no neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Well, she's trying to whitewash her grandfather. I think her brother has come out and confirmed that her grandfather was the one who was writing these editorials calling for the extermination of Ukrainian Jewish population. So, you look at these things and you realize that, that there's also there's a move to bring Israel in to help arm Ukraine. And there's some in Israel very upset about that because they know that the Ukrainian government has a Nazi problem. So, the whole world has gone topsy-turvy over this situation. And I forget what we were talking about when we got to this, but anyway, these are issues that are going to come out, I think, in the coming months. Now, one other thing, John, I want to just throw out onto the table for discussion, which goes back to what you and I were first talking about when we first met each other. The discussion that's come up largely through Tucker Carlson about the Kennedy assassination is very, very interesting because there are now more and more people willing to consider that Kennedy was either killed by the CIA or the assassination was a project which was approved by the US intelligence establishment. And there are a whole myriad of reasons why they would do that, because Kennedy was not on the same page with them. But this has become an issue after Pompeo tried to stop it with this decision to add another 60 years before they released the papers, the documents. So, I think we're going to have, there are 2 points we're going to emphasize in the beginning of the year. One is the implications of the fraud around the Minsk agreement for Western governments. And the other is the decline of morality in the West, starting in particular in the United States with the Warren Commission cover-up of the Kennedy assassination. And this is something that's still alive in a section of the population of people who are now in their late 60s, 70s, 80s, but who remember so vividly the events of November 1963. We still have an opportunity to use those memories to shake people up, to realize they've been living with lies for their whole adult life, a cover-up. You talk about censorship and fake news and narratives. The whole story of the Kennedy assassination and the implications of the post-Kennedy policy with Vietnam and then war after war after war. Had Kennedy not been killed, it's absolutely the case that the world would be an extremely different place right now. So I think this is a very fruitful initiative, and we're going to be writing a lot about it. And I think people should just pay attention to what we put up on the LaRouche organization's site in the months ahead. We have an event on January 8th that people can register for, which is going to be an event sponsored by Diane Sayre and her Senate campaign on the question of in particular, the implication of the Minsk confessions. So there's a lot to throw into this, and hopefully the population is not going to go back to sleep again, because this would be a terrible time, a tragic decision to sleepwalk through this period of history.
I want to make two comments, kind of in the sense of, let's focus on things that people don't know that might really be helpful. And my first one is Laos. As you know, my father's career involves the knowledge of and supervision, ultimately, of special operations around the world. And President Eisenhower told President Kennedy that the main foreign policy problem you're going to have is not Vietnam, it's Laos. And that resonated with me as I was studying a little bit earlier today about the assassination of Kennedy. And there's an article that I read that actually said that Bobby Kennedy sued the manager of Sea Supply Company, of Paul Hellawell's Asia Sea Supply Company, that was a CIA cutout, for some, probably heroin or importing things in federal court when he was the Attorney General. And I'd love to find that, because it is really the Laos story with Vang Pao, and that becomes the heroin trade in the United States that kills our domestic, our people with terrible heroin problems that came in the 60s and 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Started there. And I think in that sense, President Eisenhower's warning was correct, that the real problem is what's happening here in this country. The people that ran that dope Inc. are the ones that are still taking us down today. And,
Mm-hmm.
and that ties to my other point, which I think we should, and I'm asking people to dig into the 1960s, 59 to 60s, Operation Water Pump, all of that stuff. to keep helping us expose it. I've done a lot of work on it myself, and I think it would be fruitful to pull those strings a little bit harder. The other one is I was watching a very well-made documentary on YouTube last night called "The Spider's Web." Of course, it's a common theme to call something, but it was made in 2022, and it documents very well the fact that the British, when they realized that they were going to lose their colonies, and thereby um, their the resources that need to drive the industry that were providing them with the money, they consciously, the elite families, the wealthy, the ones we talk about, the City of London, decided to go into the financing instead of into productive things, and that's the beginning of what we're seeing now all around the world, where the productivity is going away. The reason being that a conscious decision was made by these British elites to become the money laundering capital of the world. And
John, do you know who wrote the story for Spider's Web? Because I think that's someone I know who lives in Berlin now.
it might well be, and I'm going to go ahead and it's on my other computer, but I'm going to look for it real quick because I think it's important.
Yeah,
Um, what he starts off with is saying that there's $50 trillion now
yeah.
in this offshore account, unaccounted for economy it,
Hmm.
we can't get at it, we can't tax it, and I think that's really what NATO is doing, is protecting this British American Wall Street offshore tax-free economy for the elites. That that,
Well,
that
and that's absolutely right. I mean, when we wrote the book Dope Incorporated in 1978, what we were picking up on is the money laundering that was going on through, at the time, a was largely London banks, but increasingly American banks were plugging into it. And one of the things we tried to do was to stop the takeover of Marine Midland Bank, which you may remember, one of the big US banks, by the Bank of Hong Kong and Shanghai.
mhm.
And we got the superintendent of banking in New York State, Muriel Siebert, to stop the takeover of the bank in New York State. So what they did is they rechartered it as a federal bank and allowed the takeover to occur. And so Dope Incorporated starts with that as the story, and then goes back to the Opium Wars and shows how important the money laundering through Hong Kong was for the British, why they twice sent the British fleet into China to suppress the attempt by Chinese nationalists to stop the flow of opium into China, and how Hong Kong became the base of not just money laundering, but actually the establishment of this idea that it's legal to have double entry bookkeeping where you have a whole separate set of books. And so we wrote this book, The Dope Incorporated. Very close friends of mine were the researchers. I did some of the research. It was a very prominent book. And we put a picture on the cover of a syringe with the Union Jack, the British flag. And yep, that's it. And this drove the hostility against LaRouche through the roof, because what they said is that LaRouche is talking about, quote, a Jewish banking conspiracy, unquote. And he was not talking about a Jewish banking conspiracy, because there's no such thing as a Jewish bank. He was talking about money laundering. He was talking about networks of many different religions that were involved under the auspices of the British Crown. And the book called The Spider's Web, that came out, I think it was about a decade ago. This may be what was the basis of this documentary.
I have
Uh,
it. I have it here. It's called "The Spider's Web: Britain's Second Empire," a documentary film, and it's by Michael Oswald. 4 years ago. So, and it has 5 million views, so it's gotten around. I hadn't seen it before, but I think that the starting point is that when they created the Cayman or the Command Islands as
Mhm.
a Caribbean base where they could just pretend, that these transactions aren't really happening in British banking system, so it doesn't have to be taxed.
Well,
And
the whole idea of offshore banking is completely unregulated,
yeah,
no responsibility to have books that can be audited, and a place for people to park their money, whether it's from drugs, gun running, whatever illicit activity.
and he goes around the city of London talking to these elite people or their agents and saying, what do you think? Do you think that this money is legitimate? Or and the answer is always no. I mean, this 99% of this money is dark money. It's money laundering. It's dope money. They know it, but they've created a mental block that makes them think that, well, it's okay because we need to do this, or for whatever reason it's more important to have this illicit horrible economy going on that's crushing people's lives right and left all the time, and they know it, than it is to just be a nice person, to to just say, okay, let's get back to what was Jesus saying. What is this about, mercy and the golden rule, and maybe that is the right way to live. Maybe you don't have to stab your brother in the back all the time. I mean, but this is the way they look, and people just disappear. You know, um, you find somebody saying something interesting, and suddenly you find out that they are the most anti-Semitic person you ever heard of, and you never want to hear from them again because suddenly they say something that's like, oh, Hitler's really a nice guy. Oh, that's the end of you. You know, um, how did they get him to say that? Well, you know, I'm talking about Kanye. I really do think that Kanye tried to come out and to say, hey, I've been under this psychological warfare, like a Kathy O'Brien situation, and I want out. And they found some way to get him to totally disqualify himself from them. And that resonates with what you said about Jewish banking. That
Mhm.
it's the Jewish bank. Well, if you're accusing anybody uh, of anything that they can tie to uh, Jewishness, then the ADL comes in and you're dead because they
Yeah.
completely overwhelm you with whatever it takes to quash your message.
Well, that's LaRouche wrote a pamphlet one time called "He's a Bad Guy, but We Can't Tell You Why." When he talked about this method of smearing someone in a way that's completely artificial, but not having transparency, so that all people hear is he's an anti-Semite. And one of the interesting things is a newspaper was set up. Uh, I think it was called Our Town on the upper east or lower east side of New York. By the editor of it was a convicted swindler. The publisher was named Edward Kayat, but the money was produced by Roy Cohn to run this magazine that had a 20-something part series about how LaRouche is an anti-Semite. And they hired an old leftist named Dennis King from Columbia University to write a book, LaRouche and American Fascism, where he would take statements by LaRouche, where LaRouche would talk about the global banking system, and he would put parentheses, LaRouche means Jewish banking system. So he couldn't even find a quote where LaRouche said Jewish bankers or Jewish banking system. We did talk about Jewish organized crime in the sense that we talked about the Lansky connection with the Lucky Luciano Sicilian connection, the Bronfmans. There was a Jewish organized crime operation. That wasn't based on the Jewish religion. These were just people who used networks uh, that were familial.
Right.
And yeah, but that's how they smeared Lynn over many, many years. And I had the case when I ran for US Senate in 1990 in Texas. the Houston Post, which no longer exists, but was one of the two papers in Houston. The editor was named Lynn Ashby, someone that I knew. I'd talked to a number of times. He wrote an editorial saying, "Don't vote for Schlanger for Senate because he's anti-Semitic." Now, he knew that wasn't true. And I confronted him about it. And he said, well, we had to do it. And he wouldn't tell me why he had to do it. So I went to a couple of years later, I went to the person who was the head of the Anti-Defamation League in that area, greater Houston area, and confronted her with this. And she said, look, I know you're not anti-Semitic, but this was our orders from the National ADL. And so who's the National ADL? Well, the Anti-Defamation League was originally set up to protect the Jewish organized crime networks from being put under police surveillance by saying that it was anti-Semitism leading the police to crack down on them. Now, this is a classic example of disinformation. What's his name? Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel,
and isn't his
Arnold
daughter
Flegenheimer. These were gangsters. Didn't matter that they were Jewish; they were gangsters.
and isn't his daughter running the ADL now? I can't remember her name, but it's.
Oh no, it was Mira Lansky, who is not related to, and that was some years ago.
Oh, I was wrong about that. Okay.
Yeah, but the other place to look is the Seagrams family, the Bronfman family. The Bronfmans ran Seagrams. Edgar Bronfman became head of the World Jewish Congress. He may not have been the worst guy in the world, but his family was a bunch of gangsters who collaborated with Joe Kennedy during the Prohibition era, running booze through Canada, from Canada in the Western New York State. And they set up companies that were like Sports Services and Emprise. These were companies that took over parking lots of major stadiums. And why would they do that? They'd make these bids that were incredible to the city, that they would pay back more per dollar of cost than anyone else, because they could use it to launder money. Parking lots were mostly cash. And there was a famous case, a reporter in Arizona who was exposing this, who was blown up in a car bomb. Yeah. So, there are real consequences if you try to tell the truth about these things. And
have you seen, sorry to interrupt you, but I've had this queued up for a minute. I want to know, have you seen or do you remember the Lyndon LaRouche Illuminati card?
No.
I'm going to show it here. If you're not familiar with the Illuminati cards, they were published way back, maybe around 2000 or so, and it's a remarkable deck of cards that basically gives you the idea that there's all these elite people sitting around a poker table with these cards, and I'm going to play the CDC disaster card, and I'm going to play the monster card, and I'm going to play the New York City blows up card, and this is the Lyndon LaRouche card, and it's all about beams. If I look at the details of it, because what they're talking about is the SDI proposal, and trying to completely steer everybody away from Lyndon LaRouche's SDI proposal. It says beams from space, protecting our way of life and destroying the godless commies. And then they try to make him look crazy by putting a bunch of arrows up there with the grassy knoll and the CIA and the Queen of England, FBI and Mickey Mouse, all definitely connected by arrow lines. And to me, I think, wow, this really shows that they were afraid of Lyndon LaRouche, because they tried to make sure that everybody knew not to look at his stuff, because he was just this goofy guy with funny wall charts.
Well, now you look at the Matt Taibbi articles on the Twitter question, and the argument that the government is using, and people who are proponents of censorship, is that, well, Twitter is not a First Amendment right because the First Amendment applies only to stopping government, prohibiting government from censoring free speech. And there's no prohibition against private corporations doing that. Well, first of all, that's a stupid argument. But secondly, it's also completely been disproven by the fact that the FBI was meeting with Twitter, the CIA was meeting with Twitter, the State Department, the Defense Department had regular meetings to discuss content moderation. In other words, censorship. And now that for years we were warning that the FBI was not every FBI agent, but the FBI as an institution, starting with J. Edgar Hoover and moving forward, was an institution that was run on behalf of Wall Street and run on behalf of a corporate aristocracy. And many people began to see that. Many Republicans began to see that around Russiagate and the role of the people who were involved in the use of the Christopher Steele dossier against Trump. The fact that the FBI knew that it was a fabrication and yet used it in the FISA court to get a warrant to spy on the Trump campaign. Now we're seeing the same story coming out around the Hunter Biden laptop. The 50 top former intelligence operatives signed a letter saying this has all the classic earmarks of a classic Russian disinformation campaign. I'm accused of being a Russian disinformation agent because I talk about the fact that NATO has an interest that's not being presented when it comes to using Ukraine against Russia to try and weaken Russia. I'm in effect speaking on behalf of the Ukrainian people by saying they shouldn't be slaughtered in a war that has nothing to do with their freedom and sovereignty. And for saying that, I'm accused of being an information terrorist on behalf of Putin. So what you're pointing out, these kinds of stories to discredit people, and same thing with Assange. You look at the Assange case. Look at a number of whistleblowers, Bill Binney, people who were talking about things that Snowden also showed, the use of 9/11 to establish a security state. And what happens? You say these things and you risk going to jail for the rest of your life or being assassinated. So, if more people talk about it, and that's why I brought up the Kennedy question. That's why Helga Zeppler-Roush is saying we really should revisit what happened with the Warren Commission report to suppress a real investigation. That if more people talk about it, on top of what we're hearing from the Twitter files, from Russiagate, and so on, well, maybe we've got a chance to break apart this illegal, corrupt, criminal apparatus that's not there to protect the American people, but it's there to protect the American oligarchy.
And I think that the theory that I have is that Kennedy was killed because he was interfering with the financial system's adaptation, if you will, to the to the dark money, to saying we are going to take this dark money and we're going to be the money launderers for the world here in the city of London, in that financial empire of its own that doesn't subject itself to British government oversight. It's its own. It's a law unto itself, and that because they have made that moral judgment to go ahead and launder money for criminals, they are the most vulnerable. They're the ones that I think we have to look at. And you mentioned the last time we talked about the House of Lords and how they seem to get a free pass, but that's where the oligarchs are. That's where they get their money from. So yeah, I'm completely with you on unpacking the Kennedy assassination. We already know so much. It's just a matter of getting somebody in the media to, and that's, I agree with your comment about Tucker Carlson. By the way, some people are saying that the person that he heard that from was actually Donald Trump. Have you heard that?
No, but that would be very interesting. I mean, if so, it points to something that has disturbed me no end, which is that Trump refused to follow through his pledge to fully declassify the Kennedy documents. And I've been told that the reason he did that was under the advice of Pompeo, that he decided not to do the declassification. I mean, the Tucker Carlson thing is interesting. And, I think if more people are demanding that this story be told, we'll find out who actually does know about this. Because if Trump was the source for Carlson, somebody told Trump. I mean, he wasn't there at the time. So you have people in the intelligence community who know the truth.
You know
And
who
I'm
I think
assuming
who I think it was? I think it was Roy Cohn.
well, Roy Cohn might have been the one who told Trump. That's a good hypothesis.
Just a
Uh,
guess, but I mean, just based on what I've learned in the past couple of years, Roy Cohn knew a lot.
well, Cohn was an attorney for what was at the time called Jewish organized crime, but he also was one of these lawyers that if you had a tough case and needed a real bastard to fight it out for you, he was the one that was hired.
Hmm.
And he went after us extensively, incredibly. I mentioned that he helped found this newspaper to attack us in New York and was involved in a lot of the slanders against us. And so we turned around and published some things that he didn't want known publicly. And he came to us through a back channel and just said, "Okay, let's drop this." And he stopped attacking us, and we didn't really stop attacking him because he was continued to play a role. But Cohn is an example. Remember, where did he get his start? With Joe McCarthy.
Well,
Joe,
he was an active lawyer before that, though. I mean, that's where he
right.
got his infamy.
Yeah.
But
I don't know too much about what he was doing before the McCarthy period. What was he?
Generoso Pope, you remember that name?
Yeah,
Uh,
from National Enquirer.
yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
Generoso Pope, and that's where his Italian connection, his mafia connection, and from there, uh, it's just, if you want to get into where did Roy Cohn come from, I think looking at Generoso Pope is always worthwhile because he's a very important behind the scenes figure in the 30s, 40s, 50s that I didn't know anything about until I started
Mhm.
digging into it. Well, tell me a little bit more about Mike Pompeo, if you would. Why would Trump listen to him? And who is Pompeo really, if you can tell, if you know?
Well, Pompeo is a West Point graduate. Pompeo is close to people like Trump's former Defense Secretary Esper. He had time in the Congress. And when he became CIA director, he had access to all of these secrets. And remember what he said? He gave an address where he said, "We lie, cheat, and steal." We have training sessions on that. And he wasn't kidding. And Pompeo is someone who was and still is extremely ambitious and therefore very dangerous. Now, how deep his connections go, we're just starting to look into it because if Trump falls by the wayside, it's not just DeSantis who's out there. Pompeo is very serious about a presidential campaign.
Oh boy.
Um, but as CIA director, same thing with Bush. People forget that George Herbert Walker Bush spent time as the CIA director. And then if you go back, you find that Bush had connections to the intelligence community going back before the Bay of Pigs. And his company, his offshore oil company back then. So you find this web of connections, and of course, Bush's connections go back before that to his father, Prescott Bush, who was part of the Harriman crowd, which was the core of the pro-Nazi Wall Street bankers. So, as you unravel this, what you find, and that's an important one, because as you and I have discussed many times before, you can't understand where Hitler came from without understanding the corporate cartels, the trusts, and the specific role the British played, and especially Montague Norman, the head of the Bank of England, in coordinating the relations between New York bankers and Berlin bankers, Frankfurt bankers, the banks that were involved in the funding of Hitler, with money that came from the Union Bank Corporation of New York, the Bush Harriman Bank. So when you start peeling these things back, and then you see Kennedy knew this. Kennedy was aware of this. There were a lot of people who were aware of this, but didn't talk about it. And Kennedy was someone they feared that he might actually go forward and discuss it. And as president, he could do something about it. And the fact that he was setting up a potential alternative to the Federal Reserve, which has always been an institution controlled by the largest private banks. It's not a government agency. It's not even an agency unto itself. It's controlled by the largest banks of the United States and also of Europe. That's why with the 2008 crash, not only US banks were bailed out, but we bailed out French and British banks. So when you put this picture together, and that's why I'm interested in the Spider's Web documentary. What's the name of the person again? I want to.
Sure.
Alston?
Yeah, it's Michael Oswald.
Oswald.
Yeah, and it's published by Independent POV on YouTube.
Okay. So you realize, John, there are a lot of people doing a lot of independent research on these things.
Indeed.
And you are providing a forum for some of those people. There are other websites that are doing that. I just saw something recently by Whitney Webb that was very interesting on the Anti-Defamation League. Did you see that? Are you familiar with that?
No, I haven't seen that yet.
It's very interesting. So, as more of this comes to the surface, people will begin to be thinking in the proper way to understand why we're headed toward a nuclear war with Russia that's not in the interests of anybody on the planet except a small group of multi-billionaires.
Yeah. Follow the money. And I think most of the money is in offshore bank accounts right now. And if the people of Britain were to realize that their whole government is being run in order to sustain the horrific crimes of this cabal that uses those banks for its money laundering, then perhaps we could shake it up. And in the United States, we've got to have that's again another reason why they had to get rid of Kennedy, because Kennedy had personality. He had
Yeah.
popular appeal. He had people who wanted to see him. I mean, they flocked to him, and he really knew how to talk to the crowd. He was a great American, a great communicator, and somebody that didn't bend on his principles as far as yeah, we're going to let the former colonial world develop, and not only that, we're going to help them. And
Yeah.
that was completely unacceptable. So hopefully, as we keep unpacking this, and so many people have helped me, and like for instance about Generosa Pope, it was David Cranmer Underdown that turned me on to that lead. So he's a very valuable asset. He publishes on Twitter. And thank you all very much for being with us this morning. Welcome to 2023, Harley and me. Uh, and Harley, I love what you said about Austria. I had the pleasure of visiting Vienna to sing there for almost a month. And it is a completely different world from the northern Northern European.
It's relaxed, it's laid back.
Yes.
People actually enjoy life, whereas in Germany, you always have a sense that someone's got a stick up their rear end.
Yeah, well, it's cold in Germany. You got to make a lot of
Yeah.
money to pay for the bills. But in
Yeah.
Italy, you can just kind of sit back, or. Anyway, Southern Europe and Northern Europe, will they ever get together? Thank you, Harley. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.